25,000 feet above the French coast, on the morning of May the 1st, 1943, Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith hand-cranked the armored hatch of his ball turret and crawled into a fuselage that was already dissolving in flames. He was 31 years old, flying his first combat mission, and he had spent the last 6 weeks being told he was the single worst soldier in the entire 306th Bomb Group. This was the bloody spring of 1943. The 8th Air Force was learning a brutal lesson over occupied Europe. The average B-17 crew had a 50% chance of surviving their 25-mission tour. The mathematics were cold and unforgiving. On this specific morning, 78 flying fortresses took off from England. By sunset, 7 would be smoking craters in the countryside, and 75 young Americans would be erased from the roster. Staff Sergeant Smith was supposed to be one of those statistics. The men at Thurley Airfield actually expected it. Not because the mission was dangerous, every mission was dangerous, but because Maynard Smith was, by universal agreement, a liability in a flight suit. They called him Snuffy, after the lazy, shiftless character in the comic strips. The nickname fit. Smith was a decade older than the 20-year-old kids he flew with, and he resented every order they gave him. He hadn't joined the Army Air Forces out of patriotism. A judge in Michigan had given him a stark ultimatum: go to jail for unpaid child support or go to war. Smith chose the uniform to avoid the prison cell, but he never intended to be a soldier. He slept through briefings. He lectured superior officers on their incompetence. His disciplinary file was thicker than his personnel record. For 6 weeks, pilots had a standing rule regarding the abrasive little man from Michigan. Nobody wanted him on their plane. But on May 1st, a crew was short a gunner, and the man nobody trusted was the only replacement available. Welcome to Frontline Memoirs. You are the guardians of history, the ones keeping these forgotten stories alive. By being here, you are doing something vital. You are refusing to let the past fade into static. You are ensuring that the men of the 306th Bomb Group, the ones who flew, the ones who fell, and the ones who barely made it back, are never forgotten. Today, we are documenting the ultimate paradox. A man who climbed into a B-17 a criminal and climbed out a Medal of Honor recipient. This is the story of Snuffy Smith, a soldier who tested the memory of the 8th Air Force more than anyone else. In the spring of 1943, the 306th Bomb Group operated out of Thurley, a converted airfield in the English countryside. The atmosphere in the barracks was defined by youth and fatalism. The pilots, navigators, and gunners were barely out of high school, average age 20. They wrote letters home to mothers they might never see again and drank warm beer in the local pubs, bonded by the shared trauma of the air war. And then there was Maynard Smith. At 31 years old, Smith was a relic to the men around him. He was short, standing only 5'4", with a receding hairline and a permanent expression of disdain for authority. While the rest of the squadron had volunteered following Pearl Harbor, Smith's path to the ball turret was court-ordered. A judge in Michigan had looked at Smith's record of unpaid child support and failure to provide for his ex-wife and offered a binary choice: a prison cell or a uniform. Smith chose the Army Air Forces, viewing it as the lesser of 2 incarcerations. He brought his resentment with him to England. The men of the 423rd Squadron nicknamed him Snuffy, a reference to the shiftless, unkempt hillbilly character Snuffy Smith from the popular comic strips of the day. The name was not affectionate. Smith refused to salute officers he deemed unintelligent. he shirked physical training. When other gunners spent their downtime cleaning their weapons or studying aircraft identification silhouettes, Smith sat on his bunk, lecturing anyone within earshot on the flaws of the military hierarchy. The Army Air Forces relied on cohesion. A B-17 crew was a single organism, 10 men whose lives depended on absolute trust in the man next to them. Maynard Smith made trust impossible. The rejection from the flight crews was immediate and administrative. Pilots filed formal requests to keep him off their rosters. Aircraft commanders, desperate for gunners in a theater with a catastrophic casualty rate, still drew the line at Snuffy Smith. For 6 weeks, while the 306th flew mission after mission into the flak fields of Germany, Staff Sergeant Smith remained grounded. He was a soldier with no war, an airman with no plane, and a pariah who walked alone through the mud of Thurley Airfield, waiting for the war to decide what to do with him. On the morning of May 1st, 1943, the administrative blockade against Maynard Smith finally broke. A waist gunner on Lieutenant Lewis Johnson's crew fell ill, leaving a vacant position that had to be filled before takeoff. The squadron roster offered no other options. For the first time, the 31-year-old delinquent dragged his flight bag across the tarmac and climbed into the belly of a B-17 Flying Fortress. The mission profile targeted the U-boat pens at Saint-Nazaire, a location so heavily defended that 8th Air Force crews had given it a grim moniker, Flak City. The flight out was tense but standard. The formation dropped its ordnance on the submarine yards and turned for home, leaving the smoke of the dockyards behind them. It was on the return leg, however, that the mathematics of the mission collapsed. As the formation approached the coastline, the cloud cover thickened, obscuring the ground below. The lead navigator, relying on dead reckoning and brief glimpses of the terrain, made a calculation that would prove catastrophic. He identified the landmass beneath them as the southwestern tip of England. In reality, the formation had drifted off course. They were not crossing the English Channel, they were crossing the Brest Peninsula in occupied France. Believing they were safely over friendly territory, Lieutenant Johnson began his descent. The B-17 dropped out of the protective formation, cutting through the cloud layers to prepare for landing. The altimeter unwound, 20,000 feet, 10,000 feet, 5,000 feet. The crew relaxed. The heavy sheepskin flight jackets were unzipped. The guns were left cold. At 2,000 feet, the B-17 punched through the bottom of the clouds. The landscape that appeared in the windscreen was not the green fields of England. It was the heavily fortified harbor of Brest, a stronghold of the German Navy. The bomber was low, slow, and perfectly silhouetted against the gray overcast. The German anti-aircraft batteries on the ground did not hesitate. The sky around the aircraft instantly turned black with flak bursts. The deception was over. Johnson slammed the throttles forward, desperately trying to claw back altitude, but the B-17 was heavy and slow to respond. Radar-guided anti-aircraft guns tracked the lone bomber, walking explosions along its flight path. Simultaneously, a flight of Focke-Wulf 190 fighters patrolling the coast spotted the straggler. They peeled off and dove for the kill, their 20mm cannons charging. Inside the ball turret, Smith was curled into the fetal position, staring down at a hostile coast that was erupting in gunfire. There was no time for training, no time for lectures, and no time to regret the path that had led him from a Michigan courtroom to the skies over France. Staff Sergeant Smith was supposed to be a statistic, another casualty in a war he never wanted to fight, but he was about to learn everything in a single afternoon. The German fighters slashed through the bomber's defenses, their 20mm cannons hammering the fuselage. One shell struck the critical junction at the wing root, rupturing the fuel tanks positioned directly above the radio compartment. High-octane aviation gasoline sprayed into the interior of the aircraft, drenching the equipment, the bulkheads, and the floor. Within seconds, a spark ignited the vapor, and the midsection of the B-17 transformed into a blast furnace. The fire effectively severed the aircraft in two. A wall of flame blocked the path to the cockpit, cutting off communication between the pilots and the crew in the rear. In the waist section, the temperature spiked instantly. The heat threatened to melt the control cables running along the ceiling and cook off the oxygen bottles strapped to the walls. The standard operating procedure for a gasoline fire of this magnitude was absolute: evacuate immediately. Staying aboard a burning bomber at low altitude was not considered bravery. It was considered suicide. The structural integrity of the aluminum skin would fail within minutes, if not seconds. 3 men in the rear of the aircraft assessed the catastrophe. Technical Sergeant Henry Bean, the radio operator, along with waist gunners, Staff Sergeant Robert Folliard and Staff Sergeant Joseph Bukacek, looked at the inferno consuming their station. These were trained airmen. They understood the physics of aviation fuel. They made the rational calculation. One by one, they threw themselves out of the waist door and into the slipstream. Their parachutes opened against the gray sky as they drifted down toward the French coast. They would never be seen again. Down in the ball turret, Maynard Smith lost electrical power. The mechanism seized, trapping him in a plexiglass sphere hanging beneath a disintegrating machine. He manually worked the hand cranks, forcing the gears to turn, inch by inch, until the hatch finally aligned with the fuselage. He pushed the door open and scrambled up into the smoke. Smith stood in the center of the waist section. The wind roared through the open hatch, where the others had vanished. To his left, the radio room was a roaring fire. To his right, the tail gunner, Sergeant Roy Gibson, was trapped in the rear compartment, bleeding heavily from shrapnel wounds to his back and unable to crawl through the flames. This was the moment of total cognitive dissonance. The good soldiers, the ones who followed orders, saluted officers, and fit the military mold, had followed protocol and jumped. They had chosen the rational path of survival. Maynard Smith, the man with the criminal record, the disciplinary file, and the reputation for cowardice, stood alone. He looked at the open parachute hatch, the clear exit to safety. He looked at the fire. And then, in a defiance of every survival instinct and every expectation held by his squadron, he did not jump. He grabbed a fire extinguisher and stepped toward the heat. The waist section of the B-17 had become a wind tunnel of toxic smoke and radiant heat. With the side hatches jettisoned by the fleeing crewmen, the slipstream roared through the fuselage at 200 miles per hour, fanning the flames that licked across the radio compartment bulkhead. The fire was fueled by aviation gasoline pouring from the ruptured tanks above, burning white-hot and melting the aluminum ribs of the aircraft structure like wax. Smith wrapped a sweater around his face to filter the air, but the fumes were overwhelming. He discharged the small carbon dioxide fire extinguisher into the heart of the blaze. The chemical cloud momentarily smothered the flames, only for them to roar back to life the instant the cylinder ran dry. The extinguisher was designed for small electrical fires, not a high-octane deluge. He grabbed a water bottle and splashed it onto the burning metal. It evaporated instantly with a hiss, the steam adding to the suffocating atmosphere. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Stacked along the walls of the fuselage were wooden crates containing thousands of rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. As the ambient temperature inside the compartment climbed past 400 degrees, the brass casings began to expand. The gunpowder inside reached its flash point. Suddenly, the ammunition boxes began to cook off. The sound was distinct, a chaotic popping that quickly escalated into a continuous barrage. Bullets detonated inside their casings, sending lead slugs and jagged brass shrapnel ricocheting off the steel armor plates and the thin aluminum skin of the bomber. Smith was no longer just fighting a fire. He was standing inside a frag grenade that was exploding in slow motion. The rounds whizzed past his head, punching holes in the ceiling and floor. The heat blistered the paint on the walls and began to sear the exposed skin of his hands. The aircraft was dissolving around him, eating itself alive from the inside out. If you want to see if Smith survives this fire, hit the like button right now. It helps us save these forgotten stories from disappearing. Subscribe to Frontline Memoirs if you haven't already. Back in the fuselage, the heat was winning. The fire was creeping aft, threatening to reach the oxygen bottles mounted near the tail wheel. If those tanks reached critical temperature, the resulting explosion would blow the tail section and the trapped Sergeant Gibson clean off the aircraft. Smith had no water, no foam, and no help. He stood amidst the exploding ammunition and the roaring wind, realized the futility of his equipment, and prepared to improvise. Smith realized that the exploding ammunition was a greater immediate threat than the flames themselves. The wooden crates were acting as kindling, and the detonating rounds were shredding the interior of the fuselage. He made a decision that bypassed all safety protocols. With the aircraft lurching through the turbulence and the floor slick with hydraulic fluid and blood, Smith lunged for the cooking-off ammo boxes. The metal handles were incandescently hot. As he grabbed the first crate, the heat seared through his gloves and bit into the flesh of his palms. He did not let go. He hauled the 40-pound box across the vibrating deck and heaved it out the open waist window. He turned back, grabbed the next one, and threw it into the slipstream. Box after box, he cleared the magazine, his hands blistering and cracking under the thermal abuse. But the Luftwaffe was not finished. The German pilots, spotting the trail of thick black smoke pouring from the bomber, identified the B-17 as a straggler, an easy kill. They lined up for strafing runs, coming in from the rear quarter. Smith saw the tracers flashing past the fuselage. He dropped the firefighting gear, swung the port-side .50 caliber machine gun into the window, and opened fire. He sent short, controlled bursts at the diving fighters, forcing them to break off their attack. The moment the fighters peeled away, he returned to the fire. The extinguishers were empty, the water bottles were dry. He looked around the devastated compartment for any liquid. His eyes landed on the relief tube, a rubber hose connected to a funnel, used by the crew to relieve themselves during long flights, which vented urine out of the aircraft. Smith ripped the tube from its housing. He poured the stagnant contents onto the burning wreckage. It hissed and steamed, dampening the flames, but not extinguishing them. When the tube ran dry, the desperation of the situation forced a final, visceral improvisation. Smith stood over the burning radio compartment and urinated directly onto the flames. It was a grotesque, primal act of survival, a man fighting a technological inferno with his own biological waste. For 90 minutes, this cycle repeated itself. Fire, fighters, fire, fighters. Smith moved with the manic energy of a man possessed, transitioning from gunner to firefighter to medic. In the brief lulls between attacks, he crawled back to the tail section to check on Sergeant Gibson. He injected morphine, applied tourniquets to Gibson's shrapnel wounds, and dragged the injured man away from the encroaching heat. By the time the English coast appeared on the horizon, the interior of the B-17 was a charred ruin. The ammunition was gone. The fire was beaten down to smoldering embers. Maynard Smith stood amidst the wreckage, his flight suit soaked in sweat and soot, his hands raw and bleeding, having single-handedly kept the aircraft airborne through sheer refusal to accept the physics of his own destruction. The English coastline offered sanctuary, but not safety. The B-17, now barely more than a flying collection of scrap metal, was rapidly losing altitude. The flight back to the 306th's home base at Thurley was mathematically impossible. The fuel tanks were dry, and the airframe was shuddering violently under the aerodynamic stress. Lieutenant Johnson scanned the Cornish landscape and identified the nearest available concrete, RAF Predenac, a coastal defense strip on the Lizard Peninsula. The approach was a final test of physics. Johnson dropped the landing gear, praying the hydraulic lines hadn't melted in the inferno behind him. The wheels locked into place. He lined up the nose with the runway, fighting the yoke to keep the wings level. The bomber crossed the threshold, the engines throttled back, and the tires squealed against the tarmac. For a brief second, it appeared to be a textbook emergency landing. The aircraft settled. The speed bled off. But as the weight of the 30-ton bomber transferred from the wings to the landing gear, the structural reality of the last 90 minutes caught up with them. The B-17 Flying Fortress relied on a semi-monocoque design, where the aluminum skin and internal ribs shared the load of the aircraft. In the midsection, around the radio compartment, that integrity was gone. The intense heat of the gasoline fire had annealed the aluminum skin and warped the longitudinal stringers, the metal spine of the aircraft. The fuselage was no longer a rigid tube, it was a charcoal skeleton held together by control cables and luck. As the bomber rolled down the runway, the fuselage simply gave up. With a sickening metallic screech, the aircraft snapped in half just aft of the wings. The tail section, no longer connected to the nose, collapsed onto the tarmac, grinding along the concrete in a shower of sparks before coming to a violent halt. The nose section skidded forward, severing the control lines and leaving the pilots sitting in a cockpit that was now towing a trail of debris. The silence that followed was absolute. Ground crews and emergency vehicles sprinted across the airfield toward the wreckage. They carried stretchers and fire axes, their expectations grim. A bomber that broke in half upon landing usually meant a recovery operation for bodies, not a rescue mission for survivors. They approached the severed waist section, the metal still pinging as it cooled. Instead of corpses, they found Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith. He climbed out of the shattered fuselage, stepping onto the grass of Cornwall. His flight suit was stiff with dried blood and soot. His hands were wrapped in makeshift bandages. He looked like a man who had walked out of a blast furnace. Ignoring the medics rushing toward him, Smith turned back to the wreckage and helped pull the wounded tail gunner, Sergeant Gibson, from the debris. The ground crews stood frozen. They looked at the holes in the fuselage, later counted at over 3,500 individual punctures from cannon shells and shrapnel. And then they looked at the small, abrasive man who had somehow kept the two halves of the airplane together long enough to reach the ground. On July 15, 1943, the United States Army Air Forces prepared to orchestrate its perfect propaganda moment. The setting was Thurley Airfield. The occasion was historic, the first presentation of the Medal of Honor to an enlisted airman in the European theater. The dignitary presiding over the event was no less than Henry L. Stimson, the Secretary of War, a man who answered only to the President. The Army left nothing to chance. A ceremonial platform was constructed on the tarmac. A military band stood at attention, instruments polished to a gleam. Thousands of airmen were assembled in formation, their uniforms pressed and shoes shined. The International Press Corps positioned their newsreel cameras to capture the consecration of an American hero. The script was written, the stage was set, and the Secretary of War stood at the podium, Medal of Honor in hand, waiting for the arrival of Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith. He did not appear. The minutes ticked by. The band shifted uncomfortably in the heat. General Ira Eaker, the commander of the 8th Air Force, scanned the assembly. The hero of the hour was nowhere to be found. A frantic search party of junior officers fanned out across the base, checking the barracks, the latrines, and the flight line. They found no trace of him. Finally, an aide burst into the mess hall kitchen. There, surrounded by steam and the stench of boiled cabbage, stood the recipient of the nation's highest military honor. He was not preparing a speech. He was not donning a dress uniform. Maynard Smith was wearing a dirty apron, his hands submerged in a sink full of greasy dishwater, scrubbing breakfast trays. The irony was absolute. In the weeks following his heroism over Brest, Smith had not transformed into the model soldier the Army desired. He had remained snuffy. His arrogance and refusal to follow routine orders had resulted in yet another disciplinary infraction. While the War Department was printing citations declaring him a paragon of valor, his squadron commander had assigned him to kitchen police, KP duty, the lowest, most humiliating punishment available for an enlisted man. The officers dragged him from the scullery. There was no time for a shower or a change of uniform. They rushed him to the tarmac, wiping the worst of the kitchen grease from his hands as they ran. When Smith finally mounted the stairs to the platform, the contrast was jarring enough to border on dark comedy. Standing next to the immaculately tailored Secretary Stimson and the decorated generals was a small, disheveled man with a fresh haircut, but the distinct air of the scullery about him. Stimson leaned forward and placed the blue ribbon and the gold star around Smith's neck. The cameras flashed, capturing the image that would run in newspapers from New York to Los Angeles. The Army public relations machine released the photos with captions extolling his bravery. They carefully omitted the fact that 10 minutes prior, the greatest hero of the 8th Air Force had been scraping leftovers into a garbage bin. The ceremony ended, the band played, and the generals saluted. But as the formation dismissed, the men of the 306th Bomb Group knew the truth. The medal changed the uniform, but it did not change the man. Snuffy Smith was a hero, but he was still on KP. The Medal of Honor is intended to be a capstone of a military career, but for Maynard Smith, it became a burden he could neither carry nor put down. In the months following the ceremony, the fame acted as an accelerant to his worst instincts. He began signing his correspondence Sergeant Maynard Smith, CMH, flaunting the decoration before the ink was even dry on the citation. But the adrenaline of May 1st had faded, leaving behind the corrosive reality of the air war. Smith flew 4 additional combat missions. On each flight, the trauma of the ball turret, the isolation, the cold, the memory of burning flesh, compounded. By late 1944, the flight surgeons intervened. They diagnosed him with operational exhaustion, the World War II euphemism for a mind shattered by combat stress. He was permanently grounded, removed from the war he had briefly mastered. Confined to a desk job, Smith's behavior deteriorated. The discipline that had been tenuous before the medal now evaporated completely. He arrived late, left early, and treated superior officers with open contempt, shielded by the blue ribbon around his neck. But the Army's patience was finite. In December 1944, the unthinkable happened. The Army issued orders reducing the Medal of Honor recipient to the rank of private. It was an administrative humiliation almost without precedent in American military history. The hero of the 8th Air Force was sent home not as a conquering sergeant, but as a low-ranking problem soldier discharged to clear a bunk. Civilian life offered no softer landing. Smith returned to Michigan to a hero's parade, waving to crowds who knew the newspaper headlines but not the disciplinary records. Once the confetti was swept away, however, the silence set in. The skills required to survive a burning B-17 did not translate to the peacetime economy. Smith drifted through a series of clerical jobs and tax work, fired repeatedly for the same insubordination that had plagued him at Thurley. His personal life followed the same fractured trajectory. He married and divorced 3 times. The women who were drawn to the war hero soon found themselves living with the difficult, abrasive man behind the myth. Legal troubles over unpaid child support, the very issue that had forced him into the military in 1942, returned to haunt him. As his world shrank, his stories grew. In the decades that followed, Smith gave interviews where the events of May 1st warped into mythology. He began telling reporters that he had flown the damaged B-17 back to England himself, a feat actually performed by the pilot, Captain Johnson. He claimed he had treated the crew while the plane was upside down. The embellishments were tragic and unnecessary. The documented truth of his 90 minutes over Brest was already extraordinary. But for Maynard Smith, a man whose life outside that fuselage was a catalogue of failures, the truth was no longer enough. He spent the rest of his life polishing the myth, trying to make the one day he was great compensate for the thousands of days he was merely human. Maynard Harrison Smith died on May 11, 1984, in St. Petersburg, Florida. He was 72 years old, his body finally succumbing to heart failure after a lifetime of hard living. He passed away far from the flak fields of Europe and the freezing cold of the ball turret, ending his days as a retiree in the humidity of the American South. The United States military, despite the demotions and the decades of administrative headaches Smith had caused, honored its obligation to the highest decoration. The Medal of Honor supersedes rank, and it supersedes conduct. It grants the recipient the right to rest in the most hallowed ground the nation possesses. Smith's remains were transported north to Virginia, to Arlington National Cemetery. The burial was a final testament to the paradox of his life. In Arlington, the hierarchy of the military dissolves into the democracy of death. Generals lie just yards away from privates. Men who planned the wars rest beside the men who fought them. Smith was interred in Section 60, grave 749. The white marble headstone that marks his resting place is sparse. It records his name, his dates of birth and death, and the inscription of his award. The stone is notable for what it does not say. It does not mention the prison sentence he avoided in 1942. It does not record the 6 weeks he spent grounded because no pilot would fly with him. It says nothing of the demotion to private, the failed marriages, the embellished stories, or the fact that he received his country's highest honor with dishwater drying on his hands. The marble sanitizes the man, leaving only the hero. Perhaps that is the only way to remember him. The story of Snuffy Smith challenges the easy narrative of warfare. We want our heroes to be noble. We want courage in combat to be a reflection of character in life. Maynard Smith proved that courage is not a permanent state of being, but a momentary choice. For 90 minutes over the coast of France, a man who was flawed, difficult, and selfish reached into the depths of his own survival instinct and found something transcendent. He saved 6 men. He saved a B-17. He did the impossible when the better men had already bailed out. He was a bad soldier who had a perfect day. And in the unforgiving calculus of World War II, that was enough. Smith's story ended in Florida, and his body rests in Virginia. But the memory of the 306th Bomb Group is kept alive by people all over the world. We want to know where you are watching from. Are you in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, or somewhere else? Drop your location in the comments right now. You are part of this history, and by being here, you ensure that the story of the worst gunner to ever win the Medal of Honor does not fade away. Thank you for watching.